With the help of Hashem, we are learning Moed Katan Daf Hey. We left off on Daf Dalid Amid Bey's mamish, few words at the end of the last line of the Amid. We will first be learning the contrast, the halachic contrast, when it comes to clearing out water cisterns, wells, water containers versus digging out new ones, and how this difference between clearing out versus digging new ones will be different whether the water source is for an individual or the other side, whether a water source is for the rabbim. Now I know we're going to be using certain terms just to give a heads up. There's a big machlokes. How does one define a rabbim for these halachas? Let's go that a rabbim means for 10 people or more. Other people have other approaches. And if you remember yesterday, we were speaking about, doing work for getting vegetables to be eaten on Yom Tov. We will also clarify a big machlokes rishonim that speaks about all of these topics when it comes to water, for example, today, whether we are speaking about water that's going to be used on Chol HaMoed, or whether we're speaking about water that's going to be used after Yom Tov, as we'll speak out. Now, it's going to be a very interesting daf. A lot of it will be related to dinim of Tumor and Tara, beginning with we Yidden, we mark the graves. When there's a grave site, we put a tombstone, or let's use our verbiage, we put a tzion, we put a marker. I want you to know that in those days, they didn't put stones. The stones are much better because they last longer. They would use lime, and they would paint the ground, not mamash on top of where the person is buried, but they would go a little bit beyond it. And they would make a marking on the ground. Now, just to know that the challenge with making markers out of lime is that with time, with rain and with the weather, it gets washed away, and there was a need to continuously, every now and then, remark them. So first of all, where do we find in the Torah a source of making such markers? The main reason that we will learn today about making markers is that let's begin with kohanim. And Bizman Beis HaMikdash Chaim, when you had food, kachim, that may not become contaminated. If I will walk over a grave or within Dalad Amas from a grave, I become tamei, Tomazoil. We'll speak about details in a moment. And then, if it's not marked, then unbeknownst to me, b'shoigig, I became tamei. I don't know about it. I'm going to touch foods that are called kachim, and I'll make them tamei. And then people can eat kachim that are tamei. Just the making of kachim tamei is a violation. So to prevent truma and kachim and people and kohanim, a kohen may not become tamei to corpse tuma. You mark the graves. That's the halachic reason why you do that. There are many other mystical reasons as well. There is a big inyan to go and daven at a caver. We're gonna leave that for another time. We're going to discuss where do we find sources in Tanakh that it's an inyan to mark graves. We're going to have a story of a student of Rabbi Yanai, a phenomenal story, and God willing, we will learn the Marsha's understanding of that story. We're going to learn details of how much of the corpse needs to have a tzion marker. Now, when you say how much of a corpse, so sometimes tragically, you don't have the entire body. You only have part of the remains. And as we will see, whenever it's such a minute amount that does not give off Tomazoil, even if it gives off Tuma, if there is contact, but there's no contact, it's buried, then you don't have to make a marker. And finally, we're going to learn about the concept of a beis hapras. A beis hapras, as we will actually see, there are 3 types of beis hapras. Beis hapras is a field in which either we don't know where someone was buried. There's someone buried somewhere here. We just don't know exactly where. Now, midrabanan, if you enter that area, you have to suspect that maybe I walked over the grave. And every person or thing that went into a beis hapras is tamei midrabanan. There is another type of beis hapras. The word pras means a piece of. And that is that we know that there was someone buried here. But we also know that this area was plowed over. Now, the laws of burial here in LA, I don't know how it was in the times of Chazal, but if someone used a plow and they went accidentally, or God forbid, b'mezid, over the remains of a body, the plow would go deep enough into the ground that it would actually rip apart the remains and it would drag it and spread it out. So there's a certain area within where someone was buried that if that area was plowed over, we are choishish that maybe enough of a fragment, maybe of a bone of the remains is on top of the ground, and therefore if someone were to walk through that area, they might touch that fragment. We will learn that there's another type of Beis HaPras, and we will see how all of this is related to the Mishnah's mentioning regarding what you may or may not do on Chol HaMoed, and the Mishnah brought up the marking of the graves. So it's going to be primarily a daf of Tumor and Tara. But Chavra, let us begin again. We left off on daf Dalid, Amid Beis, mamash at the end of the daf. The Gemara is referring back to the Mishnah. The Mishnah says that on Mesaknin, excuse me, daf Hey, Eskilkulei Hamayim Shebereshus Harabim. That if there is a damaged water cistern, you are allowed to fix it. Fixing it will mean, let's say it was there, but it's filled with debris. You can clear out, like we were speaking about the Ruchnias, that everything were intact, engraved letters, but at times we have to just clear out the debris. This is something that may be done. And just quoting another word that the Mishnah says, and the Mishnah uses the words that choitetin oisan. The words choitetin means to clear out. When the Mishnah says you can clear out, the Mishnah by implication is saying you may not dig new ones, you only may clear out old ones. And this is generally the theme that we are learning, that there's a certain amount of work that you could do, but the moment you hit tircha yeseda, a lot of work, excessive exertion, that is something that you may not do. So the Gemara takes medayik, tapar ahmed, chatita in, clearing out is okay, doesn't demand that much work, but chafir aloi, but to dig out a new water system is something that you may not do. And on that, Amar Rabbi Yaakov, Amar Rabbi Yechanan, when may you not dig out new water reservoirs? That's only if there isn't a rabim need, a communal need, a public need. But if there is a rabim need, then afilu chafira mutar, you are even allowed to dig out new ones, because as we learned clearly in the Mishnah, that the restriction of tircha yeseda, you can't do that, doesn't apply to the rabbim. I know Tzvika Yochab good yesterday. We made a correction which is important regarding the vegetables. I just want to speak it out over here. There's a big machlokes rishonim. Exactly what are we talking about? Aside of who is a rabbim, let's go that a rabbim means 10 people. Let's go with that approach. The Ritva, let's go with one mahalach, if not we'll get confused. The Ritva says that if someone needs water, one yachid, for you to drink on Chol HaMoed, then you can even dig out new water sources. Because you need to drink. What is the whole Amid that we're going to be learning about, the Rabbim and Yachid, just say it once, the Ritva says we're speaking about a water need that we know will only come up after Yom Tov. But it's going to come up after Yom Tov. So that's why, if it's not L'tzoyrech Rabbim, then you can't do that. Because the work is not being done, not for Chol HaMoed, not for the last days of Yom Tov. Nevertheless, the Chiddush is that since we know that the water resources that the city has will run out in 5 days, so therefore we want to preempt it by now digging out new water cisterns. That is what the Gemara, that's the Chiddush of Rabbi Yechanan. You are allowed to do it. It's big, even though it's not for the current need, but we will need it shortly after Yom Tov, so we can use Chol HaMoed to do it right, to do it. I want to add another detail, B'chal, when it comes to even the permitted works on Chol HaMoed, we're going to learn this soon in the Masechta. Anything that's called Maisa Uman, that means that's professional work, may not be done. Which would mean over here that even when you are allowed to dig out a new well, you're digging out a new well, and you don't even need the water now, you need it right after Yom Tov, you can't do it in a professional way. You get yeshiva bachim to do it. You understand? But it doesn't mean you can't use kalim. But you can't do it the way the pros know how to do it. That's already too much of a work. Okay, let's go weiter. And that was a big chiddush. Again, we're learning like the Ritva. I want to point out that the main other Rishon on the other side is Rashi, not Rashi over here. Again, this is probably not Rashi. Interestingly, at the back of your Gemaras, for those who have the larger Gemaras, there is the Rif, and there is Rashi on the Rif. And that either was Rashi or it was from the Talmidim Rashi. That's Rashi. Rashi disagrees with the Ritva. Rashi understands that our whole sugya is speaking about digging out water for a need of Chol HaMoed. And that's just to be aware of that there are some Rishonim that hold, imagine, that even though you need water on Chol HaMoed, if it's not for the Rabbim, you can't dig out a new cistern because it's that much tircha, and it is a huge tircha to go and find water. But believe it, we're going to follow the Ritva's approach. And we're going to have a pushback. Says the Gemara, if there is a need, then are you allowed on Chol HaMoed to dig out a new water cistern? And we're going to actually end up quoting three braises, not just for the sake of clarity. We're going to call this braisa number 1. V'hatanya, choytetin boiris. You can clear out, a pit, shichen, ditches, uma'ares, caves. These are all places in which water used to be gathered. Shel yachid. Guys, this is on Chol HaMoed. This is aligned with what it says in the Mishnah, because clearing out is not that much work. It's there, you're just clearing out the dirt. And the Ein Tzarach Loy Mishol Rabim. Now listen to how we have this braisa worded before we're going to make an emendation. The Ein Choifrin, but you may not dig out new boiros shichen u'ma'odes shel Rabim. And certainly the Ein Tzarach Loy Mishol Yachid. Beferish. In other words, the braisa clearly writes, and Rabbi Yechanan, the great Rabbi Yechanan, is an Amayda. He cannot go against the Tana. And my love, is it not that this braisa number 1 is referring to B'Sherabim, Tzrichim Lohem, again according to the Ritva, that the Rabbim, we know that Rabbim will need it right after Yom Tiv, and the braisa clearly writes that Shel Rabbim, there is no heter to be choifer, which means to dig new water reservoirs. Kasha. So the Gemara says, no, loy. The case of the braisa is only b'she'ein Rabbim tzrichim lohem. There is no need. No, it's not that if you're not going to do it now, there's going to be a problem. There won't be a problem. There'll be a problem in 2 months. So you can do that later. But that's a challenge. Asks the Gemara, if this braisa number 1 is speaking about a scenario where there isn't a need, so the braisa has to be consistent. So when the braisa was differentiating between Rabbim and Yachid, they both have to be speaking about the same scenario, which means the kavasa gabe Yachid. That also the case is that the Yachid doesn't even need it. Problem is, if the Yachid doesn't even need it, whether it's an immediate need, whether it's right after Yom Tov need, then the Yachid should not even be allowed to clear out. Because let's not forget that even though we have to get used to this, Chol HaMoed, you can't work. You're looking for a heter to go work. We're speaking about that which is considered work for Shabbos and Yom Tov, the Malachas. If you don't need it, Chatita Mishari, and Braisa number 2, the Hatanya. It says, Boirois, Shichen u'ma'oros, Shel Yachid, says the Braisa, Koinsin Mayim L'toichem. Koinsin Mayim L'toichem is something that we did not speak about yet. We're speaking about, you have a water reservoir, you have a water pit, you have a pool. The pool needs more water in it. The pool is not dirty, the pool does not need repairs. You simply have to help water get there. And you have a puddle right nearby. All you need to do is, again, people used to use their feet. They would make a little indentation in the ground to make a little path, and that would direct water nearby to go inside. That's even less work than clearing out. So that is something you're allowed to do. You may not clear out, you cannot plaster its cracks. However, but if you have a public water that is used for the Rabbim, then yes, choitetin v'shafen eset keim. B'kitzur, what do we see? We see over here in the second braisa that when the Yachid doesn't need the water, that's the case of the second braisa. If you don't need it now, you don't need it right after Yom Tov, you can't even clear it out. So the Gemara goes back, okay, ve'elamai, so what are you going to tell me? I get it. The second braisa is good. If there's no need, you can't do it at all. It must be that when does the first braisa allow it? When the individual needs the water in the pit. Ve'elamai, braisa number 1 is b'shiyachid tzarich lehem. So let's go back to our question, which would mean the first braisa is speaking about when there's a need. So when the braisa is speaking about the Rabbim, we're also speaking about b'sherabim tzrichim lehem. And the first braisa says you may not dig out a new pit. So first of all, we have a challenge. We have a challenge against Rabbi Yechanan. Says the Gemara to introduce an answer. Let's shelve Rabbi Yechanan. Okay, he's refuted. But the first Baraisa, the way we're learning it, is saying that Shal Rabim doesn't justify Chafira, doesn't justify digging new. We got a problem. Because there is a stira between this Baraisa and a third one. Chafira miyasid, is it indeed prohibited? V'hatanya. We have Baraisa number 3, which says, Boides Shichan Moedes, Shel Yachid, if it's for a Yachid, then Koinsin Mayim B'toichem. That for sure, you can help water gather in it. Number 2, even Choitetin Oisan, you are allowed to clear it out from rubble, from stones. However, Avoloi Shoifen as it came, but you may not plaster its cracks. The next 3 words are taken out in the Digduki Soifrim. I'll just read them. V'loi choitetin litoichan. You may not clear into them. It's not even clear what that means. But whatever clearing into them is something that you may not do. That's if these words are in here. And v'loi sodan oisam besit. You may not smear them with lime. However, says Baraisa number 3, V'shal rabim, choifren oisan. You can even dig new ones. And v'sadin oisan besid, you are allowed to smear them with lime. So we have a contradiction. So Rabbi Yechanan is not refuted. Rabbi Yechanan is simply echoing that which it says in the third Brais. So Ela kasha hakamaisa, and we don't want to make this into a machloikas tanoim. So the Gemara says, and this happens at times, that Brais number 1 at some point got corrupted. They learned it by heart, and they made him. You have to amend it. Amending a Brais is called tit, to be metaretz. So teritz hache, this is how you have to amend Braisa number 1. Choitetin boide shel yachid, like we learned in our Mishnah, and that's only b'shei yachid sarach lahem. Don't forget, if the yachid doesn't need it, not on Chol HaMoed, not right afterwards, you can't even clear it out. But if there's a need, since it's not digging new, you are allowed to do it. And the ein sarach loimer, the Braisa says that b'shel rabim, that you are allowed to do choitetin kisherabim tzricham lahem, when the Rambam needs it. And the Braisa adds, you know why? You know how I know for sure, Ein Sarach Loimer, that you can clear it out for the Rabbim, because the Afilu Chafira Mutar, mamish like Rabbi Yechanan. However, in reverse, the Ein Choifren Boiros Shichin Umaori Shal Rabbim, if the Rabbim does not need it, and the Ein Sarach Loimer, that you can't do Chafira for a Yachid when the Yachid doesn't need it. For sure you can't, because the Chi Ein Yachid Sarach Loimer, because if there's no need for the Yachid, Afilu Chatita Nama Aser. Bottom line is, Chevre, bottom line is that if there is a tzoyrech rabim, let's go with the ritva. Not only now, right after Yontif, then you are allowed to dig new water reservoirs for the rabbim's needs. Says the Gemara, Amar Rav Ashi, Masnisan Namadaika. This is also implied by our Mishnah, because when the Mishnah writes towards the end, Diktani Oisen Kol Tzarchei Rabim. And you know, that's the rule. Whenever the Mishnah gives this general statement, you can do all tzarchei rabim. What is the Mishnah alluding to? Kol asuyei mai, and lav, is it not to include even digging out new ones? There's nothing else to include. So the Gemara says, that's not a raya, loy, because maybe the Mishnah means to include la asuyei hadatanya. And the Baraisa writes regarding Chol HaMoed, yoitzin lekavetz et tzadurachim. It's interesting that a Beis Din today, when you say Beis Din, normally we are referring to a body of Rabbanim that will be responsible to resolve a halachic issue. There were other responsibilities on a Beis Din in the times of Chazal, including mamish, making sure that the roads are functioning properly, that you don't have the big potholes, or in those days the roads would get filled up with thorns or other branches or stones from the winter, and when people are traveling, they're going to get into trouble, they're going to get hurt. And the responsibility to make sure that the community, Begashmias, doesn't get hurt, fell on the Beis Din. And for that, on Chol HaMoed, Yoitzin, the Beis Din sends out shluchim, lekavetz at tzadurachim, to take thorns off the streets, or lesaken es harochayvus, to repair the roads, and to repair the esho istartois. I know that in Portuguese, big roads, highways are called estradas. These estradois are other types of streets that they had in the city or out of the city. Now this is already a religious need. The mikvahs that they had then, nowhere near the beauty of the mikvahs that we have nowadays. There was a body of good water, of halachically good water, and people went into that water. Aside of the fact that after a certain amount of time, it wasn't that clean. That was the Meik Shamim. But the bigger challenge is that the mikvahs themselves were not that big. So it would hold, let's say the minimum amount is 40 sa'ah. So let's say it had 50 sa'ah. It wasn't that much bigger. So over the time, a person goes in, a person goes out, they take some water with them. You have to make sure that the mikveh doesn't have less than the minimum amount. People, unbeknownst to them, will go to the mikveh, but it's not halachically okay. So they would use Chol HaMoed to go measure. And the whole mikveh she'ein by 40 sah, and if you don't have 40 sah, then right away, margilin letoichai 40 sah, on the first white line, they would direct the water into it. Now, guys, they can do more if needed, but that's normally what they would need to do. They would figure out there would be certain canals today you have on roofs, certain systems and buildings that are mikvahs, and if you find out that you need to get more rainwater, then you open up this and you close that, you redirect the water. All of that is done on Chol HaMoed. So says the Gemara. Now, before we go back to our Mishnahs that you can do Kol Tzarchei Rabim, uminayin she'im lo yatzu v'asu kol eila. It's not only that Beis Din can make such work on Chol HaMoed, or they can send shluchim. Beis Din is mechuyev to do it. And Chol HaMoed is the best time. You know why Chol HaMoed is the best time? Because people don't go to work. So let's say you need to get more water in the mikveh. Seeing to it on Chol HaMoed is very advantageous because that's where all the chevra are going to have to help. If there was an issue on the roads then, who would fix it? It would be the guys, but the guys are not busy because it's Chol HaMoed. It's a win-win. Like this, what are we doing on Chol HaMoed? Let's go to Disney World. So God saves you from that makkah. You have to go help fix the roads. You have the Hoshish Kambreda. So here we go. That if, God forbid, that all of the blood that will be spilled there is mala aleim hakasuv ki'ilu hein shafachum. It's going to be considered as if the Beis Din is responsible. In other words, if I have the power to prevent someone from getting hurt, I'm mechuyev to do that. And if I don't, it's as if Beis Din spilled their blood. Wow. And it's interesting that what pasuk are we quoting? And there's a whole machlokes whether this is the correct version. There's a machlokes in the Girs and the Gemara, but we're going to read what it says here. There's a pasuk in Parsha Shoftim that's speaking about how if there is a murder, there's an obligation on the Beis Din to adjudicate the murderer. And the pasuk writes the words "V'haya alecha damim," which means that if we don't do our job of bringing the murderer to justice, which would mean that he or she will be out there, and God forbid if they murder again, of course the main responsibility is on the person. But Beis Din has a certain responsibility. So from there you see that Beis Din, those who have the power to prevent something not good of happening, if they did not execute their responsibility, they're also secondarily, but they're responsible. So Bekitzer, since maybe the Mishnah is speaking, Kol Tzarchei Rabim means exactly everything that we mentioned. So answers the Gemara, it can be. Second line of the white lines. No, the Mishnah made mention of it. The Mishnah wrote explicitly, so therefore when the Mishnah writes the words Kol Tzarchei Rabim, what do you think the Mishnah is being asuyei mai? What is it including? It is, Rav Ashi is right. Rabbi Yechanan is right. It's coming to include this chiddush that lasuyei chafira shmamina. And you're finally going just to chazar again. The chiddush beauty is that the Ritva Staka is saying it's a big chiddush. This. It's not that you need the water on Yontif. You don't need the water on Chol HaMoed. You don't need the water on Yontif. We know as a community that right after Yontif there'll be a shortage. So that since it's for the Rabbim, you can dig new water reservoirs on Chol HaMoed. And the Mishnah said another work that could be done on Chol HaMoed is mitzainin es hakvaros. And basically from here until the end of the daf, it's going to be beautiful. We're going to be learning about where do we find again a source that you should mark graves, and we're going to learn a lot about different types of Tomazoil, how much of the corpse gives off Tomazoil, and the dinim of a beis hapras, which we'll already go into tomorrow's daf. So mitzainin es hakvaros, we mark the graves. Today there's no need for that. Unless the Nazis come into town, God forbid, because they destroy cemeteries and all the anti-Semites. But one of the beauties of using a stone as a tombstone is because a stone lasts forever. And until Tchias HaMesim, it stays there. I know that here, whoever's watching, just to know that Kevin put up on the WhatsApp a picture of a tombstone of Tzva Sirah Kodesh. It's common in the Holy Land that tombstones are painted with a certain type of blue lime. They are plastered with the blue lime. And this is for mystical reasons. There is a certain type of not good spirit that sometimes in Yiddish it's a it like it adheres to, it connects to the people who passed away, and the best repellent for Ruchos Ra is that type of glue. It's very interesting. And since Dafkin Eretz Yisrael, there's greater amount of Kedusha, especially Tzfas or these holy cities, the more Kedusha, the more Zel Umazeh, so there's a lot of Ruchos repellents, and that's the color. It's interesting. But coming back over here, then again, they didn't have stones, they would use lime, and over time the lime would disappear, and they would need to remark it. So Matzayin and Sakvara is Omer Rab Shimon ben Pazi Remez Litzion Kvarais Min HaTorah. I will find at least a remez that there is an inyan to go ahead and to mark graves biblically. The primary reason of marking graves again in Nigla is to make sure that everyone knows that here is a source of corpse tumah. A kohen may never become tummy to corpse tumah. Even people that are not kohanim, I need to know that, because if I would walk over a grave or near a grave, if there isn't a mechitza, even near a grave, I become tummy. And now if I'm not allowed to enter the holy temple, I'm not allowed to touch consecrated food, and if I do so, I contaminate it, you have to know. So when you mark it, you know. So I know it's common sense, but where do we find that emes? Minayin, Talmud Loimer, a pasuk in Yecheskel, this is regarding Goy Gomagog, that Vera Etzem Adam, that when we will find a fragment, a bone that came from a human being, Ubana Etzlei Tzion, and build a marker, Etzlei. Etzlei means near it. Again, we will see in a moment. They didn't mark exactly on top. They didn't mark too far away. They would mark it near, adjacent to it. So if the person takes up, 6 feet by a foot, so they would go 6 feet and a few inches, by a foot and a few inches. The marker would be right outside of the area of where the person is buried. Amar Lei Ravina Leravashi. The sources from Yecheskel. What are you trying to tell me, that before Yecheskel we had no such thing? Hamikama Delesi Yecheskel, but prior to Yecheskel, Man Amar, no one said it. Do we have no source? So the Gemara doesn't like the question. Just because a source is found in a VM, it doesn't mean that these, in our case, that the mitzvah of making a tzion did not exist. Yecheskel didn't innovate it. Yecheskel was the first time who put it down in scripture. And there are other dinim in the Torah that came from Moshe Rabbeinu, and it was only put in scripture later. Ulatamech, that you consider this an issue. For example, that which Rav Chizda tells us, that Davar Zeh, the following law, even though Mitoiras Moshe Rabbeinu Lo Lamadnu, we don't know it from reading the 5 books of Moses, but where do you find it? Midivrei Yecheskel ben Buznei Lamadnu. And here's a pasuk in Yecheskel that is putting a restriction on kohanim, that are certain kohanim that may not do the service on the Beis HaMikdash. So first of all, the pasuk begins with a broad statement, Kol ben Nechar. Ben Nechar means a non-kohen. But even if you have a kohen, but if the kohen is called a aral leiv, and aral leiv is a spiritual defect, that al pinigla, a kohen who is a apikoides, kohen who denies God, or denies that the Torah comes from God, he may not do the service. Or a kohen who is an aral basar, if a kohen doesn't have a bris milah, even if the machlekes rishonim, but let's say even if halachically he should not make a bris milah. And the Chazal speak about a child whose 2 elder brothers passed away right after the bris milah because they bled to death. All right, so there's an issue there with the blood. So even, and the 3rd child should not be circumcised, it doesn't make a difference. It means even if halachically such a person should not have a bris milah, a kohen who is an aral basar, it says in Yecheskel, Lo yovei al migdashei l'shor seini, don't go into my temple to serve me. Now this is written in Yecheskel. There isn't even a remes to that in the 5 books of Moses. So why do you think that before Yecheskel such a thing was allowed? It says, Mikama delesa Yecheskel man omar. And the answer is, no one wrote it in scripture, but Ella, Gemara Gemidullah. We had this as an oral tradition. The whole Torah is an oral tradition. So Hachinami doesn't bother me that there is no allusion to making a tzion near a grave in scripture. It's written in Yecheskel, not because it began at the times of Yecheskel. Gemara Gemidullah. This is already from the beginning. There's an inyan to make a tzion. So source number 1 is the pasuk in Yecheskel. Rababo Amar, I have a pasuk in the Chumash. In Parshas Tazria, it says that the Tomei Yikra, the Mitzoira needs to call out Tamei, Tamei. Why does he have to call out Tamei? Guys, the Metzoira is a source of Tumah. Him calling out is to prevent others of having halachic contact with him or with her, which would then spread the Tumah. Which means it's not only about the Metzoira. That Tumah, that Tumah should always call out and say, Paroish, keep away. Now, if you have a person that's buried, the person that's buried cannot, hopefully, call out, or if he does, I hope you don't hear it. So calling out means you make a marking. So the marking is notifying everyone, Paroish, keep away if you don't want to become Tomei.
Sorry, there's no question of disrespect for the buried, it's just a question of Tumah, walking on a grave site.
Very good, very good. So there are, Kevin, so there is also, we are careful not to walk over someone else's Kevin. It's considered disrespect. There is an upside of knowing that people are buried there is because, as we learn in Kabbalah, there's 5 levels to the soul, right? Nefesh, Ruach, Neshama, Chai, Yechida. The Nefesh stays with the remains. And the Nefesh is aware of that which is happening there. And not only that, the Nefesh communicates to the Ruach and to the Neshama that's in Gan Eden exactly what's happening. So there's also an advantage for us to know that so-and-so was buried there, because like this, if there is a need and we feel that the one who passed away is able to help us, we know exactly where to go. Kevin, correct. All of these concepts are brought down in other places, either in Nigla or in Zoyar, a lot in Kabbalah. But here the focus is just prevention of the proliferation of Tumah without people knowing, which is the worst thing. Okay. That Tumah asks the Gemara, how can you interpret these words in Parshas Tazria? Tamei, Tamei Yikra is coming to teach you that you have to announce where there is Tumah. No, didn't we learn something else from the words Tamei, Tamei Yikra? Tamei, Tamei Yikra means that a Metzoira must inform the public of his or her misfortune. Why? Knows when a person is undergoing it, tzara, it's not only therefore related to tzaras. Let people know. Many people are good at that. Let it. Why? Because then everyone will know that you are in pain and they're going to ask rachamim. I'll tell you something. If you're going to be kvetching the whole time, you'll be harassing everyone. People will ask rachmanas for themselves. God help this guy because if not, he's making the whole world crazy. So there is an inyan of letting everyone know of a misfortune. Wow. And we learned that from Tamei, Tamei, announce it. So the Gemara says we can learn both things from this pasuk, because if that is only what the Torah would have been teaching you, in Cain, the Torah could have written, excuse me, V'tamei Yikra. The Torah didn't have to repeat the words Tamei twice. The Tamei, Tamei, Shmas Minam. Yes, when a person, God forbid, is having a misfortune, let the whole world know. And number 2, there's something unique about Tumah that we have to somehow make it clear where is Tumah for people to peroish, for people to keep out, to keep away. Abaya Omer, I have another source. Again, we're trying to Mitrayras Moshe. In Parshas Kedoshim it says, Lifnei Iver Loisitin Michshel. It's amazing. Lifnei Iver Loisitin Michshel, Torah Sheval Peh, literally it means don't put a stumbling block before the blind. We know it doesn't only mean that, it means don't do anything that will somehow, even indirectly, cause someone else to sin. Here we're stretching it. We're saying it's not only that I may not do something active, I'm not doing anything. If I have the koyach to prevent someone of stumbling in a sin, b'shoigeg, then I have to do that. And if I don't mark it, I didn't do anything, but my lack of action itself is the sin of lifnei iver. Wow. Rav Papa Amar, it says, Soilu, Soilu, Pano Darach. This is a pasuk that Mamash speaks about the importance of if there is someone buried on the road, and we know that if there's a meis mitzvah, there are times that people are buried, not on a busy road, but on the highways, on the sides, people were buried, that it says in the pasuk that you have to pave. Soilu means to pave and clear the way. Clear the way means we don't move people that are buried. Make a marking. So if someone is buried near a path, that's the meaning of this verse. Make a marking so people who are traveling, they know, to keep away 4 cubits. Rab Chinana Amar, it says a pasuk in Yeshaya that Harimu Michshol miderech ami. Remove a michshol. Now, a michshol means an obstacle. Yeah, there is the physical obstacle. If there's a pothole, if there's a big stone, remove it. We just spoke about it's incumbent on the base, and this is a religious obligation. When you live in a city like here, so we delegate it, you pay taxes, you delegate it to the civil, but it's an achrayas. It also means the stumbling, the obstacle is tumah. Rabbi Yeshua bereider Rav Idi Amar, imagine, this is part of the advice that Yisro gave his son Moshe Rabbeinu, that v'hoidaito lahem, you should notify them, the people, as haderech asher yelchu ba. How beautiful is that? The path upon which they should walk. So of course we understand that, you tell people how to live their lives, their lifestyle. No, make sure that if there's a path, notify people if there's a caver there. Marzutra Amar, we're going mamash to the end of Parshas Mitzayda, where it says, V'hiz artem es b'nei Yisrael mitumasim. Hazara means to forewarn. I want you to know that the pshat there in Chumash, V'hiz means to separate. The Torah writes, separate the Jewish people from their tumah. What does that mean? It means to mark the graves. Rav Ashi Amar, the last pasuk in Achrei Mois, it says, Ushmartem es mishmarti. Safeguard my charge. Guys, that is in reference to Truma. And safeguarding Truma means we have to take extra precautions not to make Truma Tameh, not to be Metame Truma. So that's the same concept. What's extra precautions? Part of it is marking graves. Asu mishmeres lemishmarti. And if people don't know where someone is buried, then people inadvertently will become Tameh and they're going to be Metame Truma. Ravina Amar, 3 lines from the bottom, and we're going to get a little bit off it. The last pasuk in Kapitel Nun, the pasuk reads in Tehillim with a sin, V'sam derech, which means one who sets the way, the one who sets the way will see the salvation of God. V'sam derech arenu b'yesh elikim. So what does setting the way mean? That's the remes. Setting a way means make sure that on the way, if there's someone buried and people might go near it, set it, mark it. We never move the cave, only for extraordinary reasons, but that's called V'sam derech. Yes?
Was there ever, after the Shoah, with all the mass graves, was there ever halachic efforts to...
So just to point out, that's why, to our ability, people who go to Poland, you know how many places in Poland, we made an effort, the Jewish community, to make markings when we know that there was mass murders in certain locations, and if we don't know exactly where, that's going to be part of the law of the Beis HaPras. We want to put up a monument somewhere in that area for people to know that somewhere here many people are buried. And we're going to learn about this today on Amud Beis. Yeah, there's an obligation. Now, Omar Rabbi Shua ben Levi, once we quoted this verse in Tehillim, so we're going to learn a little bit of Agadat Chavras Chaparain. Yeah, we're not a Megillah anymore, but here we go. Kol Hashom, we're changing the sin into a shin. We're transforming the lefty into a righty, which is really the whole goal of life. Kol Hashom or Chosev. Now Rashi teaches over here, Hashom is from the word appraising, Rashi says. Appraising means that in life we have to start weighing things, and the words of Rashi is to weigh the hefsed mitzvah keneged schara. I got to do a mitzvah. You got to do a mitzvah, you got to pay a price. It's going to cost you with time, it's going to cost you with money. I can't, it's difficult. Weigh it. Yes, you have to invest your time, you'll do a favor, you're going to have to invest your money. But if you would know what you are accomplishing, it's going to be worthwhile. And the same thing in the reverse. Sometimes a person has a certain need and they fulfilling it in a non-kosher way. Weigh it. You might resolve your itch, but in the long run, it's gonna hurt you. So people who weigh what they do, they're shum or chaysav, they're gonna see the salvation of God, and that's the pasuk over here, where it says the pshat is a sin, right, with the dot on the left. V'sam derech. And we're saying that means mark graves. Al tikre v'sam ela v'sham. V'sham derech arenu b'yesh elikim. And the Gemara is going to tell us a story of someone who weighed what they did. And we're going to learn this with the Marsha. Says the Gemara, the last line of the Amid. Rebbe Yanai hava leyahu talmida. He had a student. And it was a great student. A great student means he constantly challenged his teacher. The chol yoime, every day that Rabbi Yanai taught, have a makshale, he would ask kashas. Good questions. Doesn't matter. All questions are good questions. Now, says the Gemara that bishapsa the rigla, Shabsa de Rigla means either Shabbos on Yom Tov. Shabbos on Yom Tov is when many, many more people came to the shul to learn, or many other people say, as we finished in Megillah, I know in the Megillah we spoke about Moshe Rabbeinu telling us that we should learn about the halachas of Yom Tov on that Yom Tov, but we extend that. If you remember, we had the Psachim either a month back or 2 weeks back. It means coming up to a Yom Tov, it was common that many, many more people came to the Beis HaKnesses or to the Beis HaMedrash, and the halachas were reviewed in public. There was a lot of people. Whenever there was a large gathering, lo yahava makshale, he would not ask. Dafei Amid Beis. So when and Rabbi Yanai appreciated that, we'll see in a moment why. And Kari Alei or Rabbi Yanai read this verse, what we just learned, with a shin that v'sham derech arenu b'yesha Elokim. Now, what was the weighing that he did? So again, what we call Rashi here says something a little bit harsh, that sometimes Rabbi Yanai did not have an answer. So whenever it's a Hamish crowd, didn't matter. He wants to learn. But whenever the whole city came, he felt that maybe you won't know how to answer my question and you're going to get ashamed, so he didn't ask. That's the way, that was the evaluation that the Talmud did, Rashi. The Marsha very strongly disagrees with that. Very strongly disagrees with that. In other words, basically, when you're learning something, you have a question, ask the question. And there's no shame for the teacher not to know, big deal. He doesn't say those words, but he doesn't like that whole approach. And he writes beautiful words. I'm reading a little bit in the Marsha Chedushi Agadis. The Marsha writes, V'nira lefi sha'kushyois betalmud al haroiv nechlakim lebeis chalakim. All questions will fall, at least almost all questions, will fall into one of the two categories. Number one, that you make a statement, and then the one who's asking says, I have a contradiction. Right? You're saying, A, I learned in another place another halacha. You have to resolve a contradiction. And then the other type of question is, Pshita, Lamali, Tanina, why did I even need for you to teach it to me? Of course, we know that already. There's no chiddush here. So says the Marsha, that what happened, B'Shapsa de Rigla, the people, a lot of people came, what's the mission? To review the basic halachas. The basic halachas are halachas in which everyone knows them. Everyone knows the Talmidim that learn every day, don't have anything to ask. There won't be contradictions, because if there would be a contradiction, it was already resolved. Many times you go to the shul on Yom Tov, you already heard that kasha, you already heard that answer. And more importantly, says the Marsha, there was no pshitas, because you know that the teacher is teaching something that you already know, because he has to review the halachas for everyone. So there was nothing to ask. It's already learned sugyas, people already know the questions, people already know the answers, the Talmidim. However, adds the Marsha, what was the beauty? That whenever the teacher is reviewing basic halachas, which is what he did before Yom Tov, many people would say, I don't have to go to that speech, I don't have to go to that drasha, I already know it. There is no novelty here. I won't even ask Pshita, because I know he's teaching the Pshita. So the beauty is that he would still go to the Beis HaKnesses, and he would go learn. And the Arenu B'Yesha Elokim, what was the salvation of God, is that he found something new in that teaching nonetheless. Well, not only did he not, there was nothing to ask, but God, in other words, the concept of Ruach HaKodesh, which is another topic we just had on Yom Yom. Ruach HaKodesh means that when someone is writing with divine inspiration, they're writing a few words, but there are so many layers of meanings to those words that the one who said it himself doesn't even know it. Because it's godly words. And really, it's a very beautiful thing, this. You know, there's a Mishnah in Pirkei Avos. One of the 7 attributes of a chacham is Almasha Loi Shama, Amar Loi Shamati. And that's a famous, if he didn't hear something, the chacham would say, I didn't hear it. Now, what is the opposite by the goylam? What does the goylam do? The goylam, when he hears something, what does he do the opposite? When he hears something new, he lies, and he says, I already heard it. That's called a liar, not a goylam. The opposite of a chacham is when someone hears something that they already heard, they say, I already heard that. You can have someone who hears a lot of beautiful words of Torah, but if one part of it they already heard, I already heard that. That's the goylam. Why is that a goylam? Because since we are learning the words of the living God, we're learning words of Torah, there's going to be something that you didn't learn yet. The Chacham is someone who says, not that I already know it, go and learn, and you will discover something that you never heard before. That was the beauty of the Talmud of Rabbi Yanai. There won't be...
Whenever you repeat a story in shul, I always hear new things every time.
Here he goes. Danny wants everyone to know that I repeat many times stories. I was told like this, sometimes. I heard that a joke you can repeat once in 2 years. A story once in 1 year. The Dvar Torah twice in the same speech because the people already. Okay, let's go. Tanakh Rabbanan. Second line from the top.
A quick question.
Yes.
It feels like all of these, this whole part of the Gemara is just trying to find the verse to prove what they're already coming with the truth.
Omri, you're so correct. I want you to know that if someone were to ask you, what's the mission statement of Gemara? And I want to give you the answer. The Gemara's mission is that there is the oral Torah, which is the main Torah. We know how to keep Yiddishkeit because we have an oral tradition. Then we have the scripture. And the goal of the Gemara is to find sources in scripture from that which we are doing. Exactly what, that's the whole purpose. And you see how many lines we're giving to it. We know that we have to mark the graves. We know it because that's our tradition. We're not looking to find out whether we're doing it right or wrong. We're doing it right, but now let's link it to the written. Yeah? Weiter. Tanakh Rabbanan. Now I want to say like this. Again, Al Pi Nigla, where was Kavan? The focus here is to prevent the proliferation of Tumor, especially the accidental proliferation of Tumor. Now, how does a corpse convey Tumor? So, there are many mediums. There is maga, touching it. There is carrying it. There is moving it. We're not going to speak about those. Because if the Tumor can be touched, it means you see it. We are worried about what we call Tomazoil. Guys, Tomazoil means 10 Tumor. There are 3 types of Tomazoil, Bekitzin. One is that if there's a corpse over the ground, under the ground, if someone or something goes over it, I am mahil over it, or the opposite. There's someone or something that is susceptible to becoming tummy, is stationary, and then or moving, but under, and the tumah goes over it, or the tumah and the person are under the same halachic tent. Okay, we're going to focus primarily here is that someone was buried, so there is tumah in the ground. It's covered over. It means you cannot see it. We're not concerned of touch. We're not concerned of moving because it's buried, but you might go over it or come near it. Okay. Now, you should know that not every time will a part of a corpse give off tumah. Of course, a whole corpse will. Not only that, I'll go by heart. A kezayis of flesh of a corpse or more gives off Tomazoil. Bones, well, if you have, we'll see, roiv minyan, roiv binyan. We'll translate that soon. Or even only the entire spinal column. Or the entire skull. There's another statement that we don't have here. It's called the roiva atzomis, the amount of bones that amount to a quarter of a kav. Less than that, if there's a little bone fragment, even though if it's only the size of a barley corn, if there is contact, there is a conveying of tumah, but it doesn't give off Tomazoil. Now, based on this concept, Kavan, that we are focusing that the main halachic reason for marking graves is to prevent Tomazoil, so if there is only a fragment, which anyways cannot give off Tomazoil, then there is no need to make a marking. Let's go read it inside. Tanakh Rabbanan. Ein mitzainin. You don't make a marking if there's only a kezayis min hameis, if there's only a kezayis of flesh, and everyone should jump and ask. That doesn't make sense, guys, because a kezayis min hameis does convey Tomazoil. So we're going to come back to that. But if there's a kezayis, you don't make a marking. Number 2, you don't make it on etzem kisoida. Even though a bone in the size of a barley corn does give off tumah if you were to touch it, but again, it's buried. The concern is not touching it. If it's above the ground, you'll see it, if you're looking for it. Nor in any other scenario where the amount of a corpse, tragically, you didn't have a whole corpse, is not enough to give off Tomazoil. So when do you hit that amount? So again, if there's flesh, it's 1 kezayis, which you don't mark. But a kezayis does give off Tomazoil. If you don't have flesh, it already decomposed. If you only have the remains, the bones, avol mitzainim, you do make a marker al hashidra, if you have the entire spinal column, va'al hagulgoilus, if you have an entire skull, or va'al roiv binyan, va'al roiv minyan hames. So if you have bones that make up the majority of the skeletal frame, and we're going to learn in other places the details of that, right? The long bones of the legs and how much of the ribs, or even if it doesn't make up the majority of the skeletal frames, but if you were to count how many bones is there in a human body, if you have the majority of that number, even if you're using little bones, so it's not the majority of the skeletal frame, but it's the majority of the bones in the body, that also conveys Tomazoil if it's buried together. It's called roiv minyan. However, another detail, are you obligated, is based on obligated to mark with lime on locations where everyone knows that there's tumor there? You don't have to do it. Everyone knows. The greatest example will be a cemetery. You know it's a cemetery. So you don't have to mark. You don't have to mark where this one and that one is. A kohen knows not to enter there. You're not obligated to mark a location that is vadai, a place where people are buried. Avol, the whole point, the whole obligation, and even on Chol HaMoed, and Beis Din is obligated is mitzayin al asfeikas. Wherever there is a suffix, you got to make a marking. The Sfas Emes, who's always very innovative, teaches like this, that when you come to a cemetery, he says, you know where the suffix is? They didn't have fences then. You got to take the perimeter of the cemetery, the outermost graves, those have to be marked. Because that is where you don't know where does the field end, where does the cemetery begin. Once you mark the outer rim, everything inside it is called vadois. So the emphasis to make sure the boundary is marked. It makes sense. Once you mark the boundary, then no one is going to enter. And if you entered within that ring or within that box, you're vadois. Right. The Eilan Asfekes is giving them, Bryce is going to give examples of places that are endowed. Sechachos uperois. Sechachos uperois is a fact that when people were taken to be buried, based on a few things, we try to bury as soon as possible. Practically, by the way, in many places people are buried at night. I know here in LA we don't bury, maybe legal reasons, and it's just all they bury at night. You bury as soon as possible. What happens if it's dark? So when people would come near the Beis HaChaim, if there would be a tree that has branches that are hanging over a little part of the side of the road, that would be a place where people would want to be buried. So like this, when people come to visit, it's shady, it's protected. Also what Kevin mentioned, there's also a mystical thing, people shouldn't walk on top of your grave. So when you bury it over an overhang, it's hard to walk under an overhang. So you have a natural overhang, which is chachos. Perois means that there were walls, these are walls that were built near the Beis HaChaim, and some stones would protrude, and it was relatively common. And Rashi gives the example that when people are being taken to be buried at night and it's dark, so people don't want to enter the cemetery, it's near enough, they would bury under those protrusions of stones. So whenever you come near a cemetery, in a Jewish cemetery, so you have to be chayish, maybe under the branches, under the protrusions, near the cemetery, people are buried. And these are the areas called, there's a suffix.
Do Kahanim have to be careful walking under those trees?
Absolutely. So Kahanim, misafik should not do it. And there's many dinim. If they did it, safik tuma, how do you judge that? Exactly. Weiter.
Rabbi, is there a limit to the vertical distance where you don't attract Tomazoil? Like if you're walking over and if it's buried deep enough?
Okay, so let me just to make it clear, that if someone is buried in the ground, but they are buried in a container that is still in existence, not the way our caskets decompose, and there is one tefach of empty space between the body and the box, that stops the tumor from going up. But if you don't have a halal tefach, which is what happens to everyone over time, then the tumor goes until the heavens. Now the question whether an airplane flying over is a problem or not, that's called a moving oil. The person is in an oil, but it's a moving oil. Whether a moving oil protects them from tumor is really subject to a debate, and let's leave it at that. Okay, and the third area where the Beis Din should mark is a field that to begin with only has a rabbinic level of corpse tumor called a beis hapras, like we'll see in a moment. There are 3 types of beis hapras. Now, when you do make a marking, don't mark directly over the corpse. Because the whole purpose is, you want to prevent people from becoming tummy. You know what happens? It's you're marking it on the ground. If you're going to put the marking only on top of it, you know what will happen? Someone won't see it, and by the time they see it, oops, it's too late. You already became tummy. So you have to move it adjacent to. But then on the other hand, don't put it too far away, because you're adding to Tumah and Eretz Yisrael. But that you do, you're going to ruin Taharis. You're giving a tzion, a siman, too late. On the other hand, don't really move the marker too far, however you define too far, because Eretz Yisrael. End of Braisa. And now we already spoke out the remaining. The Gemara asks, the first line in the Braisa is that you don't mark a place where you have the burial of a kezayis of flesh. Why not? Because one kezayis does convey tumah. Ukezayis min ameis ena matamen ba'oil v'ha tanan amishna elo shematamen ba'oil kezayis min ameis. Answers the Gemara, Amar Rav Papa, I'll tell you what the Braisa means. It's good. It means that there is exactly a kezayis. Now, Chevra, Hashem made the nature in a way where unless one is a great tzaddik, the body decomposes. So think about it. A kezayis min hameis won't remain a kezayis for a long amount of time. Another detail that you have to add, that if you only buried a kezayis min hameis, there is a certain time period from the burial until a week, I don't know the time, a certain amount, that everyone knows that a fragment, a part of a body was buried here. You don't need to put it, everyone knows about it. By the time people might begin to forget the exact location, at that time it's already decomposing. The moment it decomposed only a little bit, you don't have the kezayis anymore. Gavaldik. So says the Gemara that kezayis mitzumtzum. So since the soif mechsar chassid, soif doesn't mean in a long amount of time. In a short amount of time, you have the minimum amount that gives off tumah. In the ground, it's going to decompose. So now, people will remember someone is buried. If you don't have the marker, someone can walk on it and say, "Oh, I walked on top of that." So that might happen. No, it's for people to walk on it and not even know, we're not concerned, because for the immediate amount of time, people will know. When you put the marker, it prevents people from coming too close. You don't put the marker, people might walk over it. So even if that were to happen, it's better for there to be a certain little amount of tumah now, for which, if you then touch truma, or if you touched kachim, or if you brought their tumah and kachim, you'll have to burn it. If you put a marker, people will think that it's, when people are buried, you always leave the marker because the bones remain. But if there's only flesh and only a kazai, it's not worth it. Okay, weiter. The Braisa said, areas right under branch protrusions near the Beis HaChaim, or para'os, the area underneath the stone protrusions. Sechachos taiches the Gemara Ilan HaMesach Al Haaretz is where you have a branch leaning over, hanging over the ground. Parois means avanim parois eretzes min hageder, and that's areas that people would at times bury if the burial was done at night. Now, what is a beis hapras? So let me say it by heart. There's 3 types of beis hapras. Number 1, an area that we know there was a grave. The grave was plowed over. The area was plowed, so there's a worry, maybe there's a fragment of a bone. Now that's problematic, because again, if the bone was fragmented, there's no Tomazoil. What's the issue? There might be a piece of bone on the ground. You'll see it. In other words, why would we b'chlal have to mark a beis hapras? That will be the kash. What's a beis hapras? Kedetanan hachodesh es hakever. If you plow over a grave, so hareyu oisa beis hapras. Rabbinically, there's a certain amount of space around, adjacent to where we know the grave was, that we have to rabbinically say, you walk there, you're tamei midrabanan, because maybe there was a fragment of a bone and you touched it. How far from the known kaver is, how far away are we going to call that area a beis hapras? Meloi ma'ano, the furrow's length, when people plow, so you don't keep on going. It was a common way of plowing. So the furrow's length of a plow, and how much is that? That's 100 amma. Okay, and we'll take a see, is it 100 amma in one direction, is it 100 amas? In two directions, the answer is it's in two directions, but not in four directions. We'll leave the details for later. Frag the Gemara, hold on, a beis hapras, even if there's a chayshinon, maybe there's a bone fragment, but there's no Tomazoil, which is a problem, because if there's no oil concern, then why would we mark it? The Amar of Yehuda Mashmuel, that if a person is going to do a mitzvah that's very time sensitive, the example will be, I'm going to do a carbon pesach, and the person is late, and you only have the afternoon to shecht it. You want to get there on time, and the quicker road goes through a beis hapras, but rabbinically, if you go there, you might become tummy. If you become tummy, corpse tummy, you can't bring the carbon pesach. So normally you would walk around it, but I'm in a rush. So says Shmuel, minapeach adam beis hapras v'hoilach. The whole chashash is there might be a bone fragment on top of the ground, so blow the ground. Even if there's a little fragment, you'll blow it away. Or another solution, Rav Yehuda bar Ami says in the name of Ulam that if this place is a place beis hapras shenidash, if many people already walk there, then you know what happens when you walk on the ground? The little things that are on top of the ground gets pushed in the ground. So we can say even if it was there, it got reburied, and the little amount of bone won't be matamayu. So answers the Gemara, no problem. Then Braisa is speaking about not the beis hapras of the type where a grave was plowed, a different type of beis hapras. The beis hapras, it's called besada she'avad b'kever, that there was a grave, we simply forgot where was the grave. But the grave is intact. The bones are in there. We don't know where it is. So in that area of doubt, that's also called the beis hapras. And Shmuel's statement is besada she'nechresh b'kever. Frag the Gemara, besada she'nechresh b'kever is called the beis hapras. Gemara says yes. Actually, v'hatanan b'nichusa shloisha beis haprasein. Three types of areas that are all called a beis hapras. Number one, besada she'nevet b'kever. Number two, besada she'nechresh b'kever. And number three, usadei boichen, a wailing field. What does it mean, a wailing field? Rabbi Shua bar Abba says in the name of Ulam, that when they would bring a body from one village to the other, from one city to the other, the Chevre Kadisha from the place of origin would hand it over to the local Chevre Kadisha. In that field, it's called Sada Shemaftiram B'Meisim. What happened at times is that when they would hand over a corpse, unlike today, sometimes the body is falling apart. And being that they're giving it over to another Chevre Kadisha, there's a chayshinon that maybe a part, a limb of that person fell off, and they buried it on the spot. And then they took the remaining remains and they buried it in the Beis HaChaim. So in this field where there's a handing over of corpses, that entire field is called the Beis HaPras. Now v'tamamai Amaravimi mishum yeyush ba'alam nagoba. Again, there could have been a limb that was abandoned over there. I know we didn't finish the Amud, but we'll stop over here, and God willing, a lot more to be continued.